right?
Yeah, I'm concerned because people have been misled from day one about the Russians. Putin, at the beginning of this debacle, moved into Ukraine with a very small force, about 90,000. And this force suddenly encountered a Ukrainian army that we had built up over the previous 6, 7 years with the express purpose of fighting and destroying Russia. And he thought that he was sending a signal to the West that had not paid any attention to him, that the Russians are serious about their security and they would not tolerate a NATO presence on their border. And they most of all were concerned about our willingness to put missiles into eastern Ukraine, as the Soviets did in Cuba in the 1960s, that would threaten their cities and threaten their nuclear deterrent. There's a lot of evidence that we were absolutely prepared to do that, and that's what the Ukrainian force and the state were being built up to support. He discovered that he had no negotiating partners, but he dragged this out through March and April and finally said, well, that's it. I guess no one's going to negotiate with us. We're in a different set of circumstances. He did not, I think, expect the reckless hatred that grips Washington and their globalist allies in Western Europe. And as a result, he said, this is a game changer. We've got to go back, re-examine things. And then the Russian military buildup began. Today, you have over 750,000 troops. There are plans to go up to 1.2 million. They may well reach that by the beginning of the next year.
Is that total,
course,
or you mean deployed into Ukraine?
No, total.
Okay.
Yeah, but the 750,000 right now are around Ukraine or in it. And that force is enormous, and it's extremely well equipped, heavily armed, and by the way, very competent and very well led, contrary to what everybody says. They've inflicted devastating casualties. It's more than 400,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers now. How many casualties on the Ukrainian side, anybody knows. But when you look at the Russian side, you're looking at perhaps 30, 40,000 killed in action, maybe another 30, 40,000 wounded. And most of the Russian wounded is treated and returns to the battlefield to fight. Whereas most of the wounded in Ukraine are so severe, they'll never come back to combat. So now they're trying to basically force whatever they can find inside Ukraine into uniform to go jump into the meat grinder that's killing thousands of Ukrainians every week. And they're trying to get the Polish government to assist them in repatriating anywhere between 80 and 100,000 Ukrainian young men to come back and fight. Of course, that's not going to happen. There are all sorts of legal reasons why that won't happen. Because remember, you've had 14 million people at least move west and leave Ukraine. So this organization we call a government, this Zelensky crowd, is really weak. And they are devastated, and they're on their last legs. So what sustains them? Us.
Yeah.
We're transferring billions in cash. We own the government. We pay for the government. We pay for the military. The whole place would fold and die tomorrow morning if we suspended the aid. Now, the aid that they do need is medical. The aid they need is humanitarian. They don't need any military aid. This needs to stop. We need to suspend that. It's just killing more and more Ukrainians. Now, here sit the Russians controlling 90% of the territory where the Russian population lived in eastern Ukraine that they were trying to protect. So they've got that, and they've been sitting on it, defending it. And I think there's a lot of frustration in the senior ranks of the Russian military, because I think the Russian military has been saying for months now, let's attack and get this over with. We can crush this problem once and for all. And he's been reluctant to do that for two reasons. Number one, he really doesn't want to kill any more Ukrainians. We find that hard to believe, but he sees them as Orthodox Christian Slavs, just like the Russians. Secondly, he doesn't want the United States and NATO to intervene in Western Ukraine. So he's taken the position that let's move deliberately and incrementally to avoid a sudden impulsive move from Washington that would put them at war with us in Russia. And that's an understandable concern. But now the situation is so bad, and we are so weak, I think, in the West, as he's accurately concluded. I don't think that the potential for real intervention is there anymore. If you look in Poland, public opinion there has swung decisively against Polish involvement in the war.
Yeah.
They'll send assistance, but they will not fight. And so under those circumstances, I think his senior military leaders are saying, let's go and end this. If we do nothing and the Europeans fail to elect new governments or put new people in power that will talk to the Russians, then I suspect he'll eventually give permission and they will march west. And they could march all the way to the Polish border. I keep telling people this. And of course, that's the opposite of what we want. You know, the beauty of Ukraine, particularly if it had become a neutral state, was that it put 500 miles between the NATO border and the bulk of the Russian military, which is what we wanted. Now we're going to get the opposite because we were foolish and stupid and completely miscalculated, didn't understand the Russians, didn't understand their capabilities.
Now, isn't Washington's the foreign policy genius Mike Pence and Nikki Haley have suggested that things are going according to plan? We need to drain Russia of its resources, of its military personnel, and that's why we should be continuing this effort, and it's going according to plan in their terms, maybe just not fast enough. That's kind of the neocon talking point against Biden.
Well,
he's not tough enough, right? And they're always saying that.
Is anybody out there believe anything that the former vice president or this person, Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina, says? They know nothing. These people are uninformed and ignorant of reality. They certainly don't understand what's really happening. And even if they do, it doesn't matter. You have to look at the people who are donating to them. I keep telling everybody, you want to understand why somebody says stupid things like that make no sense, that are very dangerous. Who are their donors? And this is why you go back to Trump. One of the things we liked about President Trump was that he put his own skin in the game. He was someone that said, no, I'm not going to simply do whatever the donors want. You have someone now with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. who's very similar. And naturally, both men are widely hated and despised in Washington by the swamp because they represent a clear and present danger to the corruption. You know, it's just a big money laundering operation in Washington, and the American people are the ones whose money's disappearing, and they're not getting anything out of it.
So you don't think that Putin's decision to slow walk this war is not contributing to the diminishment of the Russian military in a way that would render the country in a much more vulnerable state going forward?
No, not at all. Russian society is incredibly cohesive and very strong, and the backing that Putin has is phenomenal. And the military establishment is excellent, as I've told people repeatedly. You have to have been there in the 1980s, as I was, and seen the deterioration in the Soviet armed forces that then completely collapsed in the 90s. Then subsequently gone back, as I did in 2001, and see the new renaissance, which then was just beginning, and the attention to detail and change and reorganization that took place in the Russian military. No, this is a very strong, capable force. And if you challenge it, you're going to have a hard time. And what I've always worried about is that we stupidly challenge them. We are soundly defeated. And then in our frustration and embarrassment, we decide to turn to a nuclear weapon. Well, that's game over. And I've tried to tell people again and again and again, stop this nonsense about a quote unquote tactical nuclear weapon. Oh, don't worry about this one. This is only 5 kilotons. They'll understand that we're not serious. We're not going to go to a all-out nuclear exchange. Well, if you're sitting in Russia or China and you have an arsenal and we use a nuclear weapon, the incentive there is immediately to respond with everything you've got because you're afraid that you'll lose it if you don't. We need to stay away from this nuclear business. And both the Russians and the Chinese have said they will not use nuclear weapons unless they are attacked with nuclear weapons. We need to stop this and get out of this business, and we need to stop fighting over it. We have no interest in Ukraine, east, west, center. We have none, no strategic interest. The only strategic interest we have is no more war in Europe. And that was the interest that should have guided us as soon as this became a conflict in February and March of 2022. That's when we should have intervened right away and said, wait a minute, we don't want a war. That's not the answer. We have to talk. But You can't talk to people if you won't listen to them.
Yep.
We refuse to listen to anything they say. And of course, we say all this ridiculous nonsense. Putin is Hitler or Stalin or something else. That's not true. Now, I don't know the man personally, but I can tell you this: Russia bears no resemblance to those horrible states in any way, shape, or form. We need to stop talking in those terms. I always ask people, well, what happened to the global caliphate?
Yeah.
Silence.
Yeah.
Well, if Russia doesn't work out for us, the attitude in Washington is, well, we'll turn on China. Well, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Why would you do such a stupid thing? And people say, well, the Chinese are this, the Chinese are that. Look, close your borders, secure your coastal waters, expel the people in the country from China who are stealing from you, who are here to do us harm. Throw them out. Let's get control of America. Let's expel these illegals. Let's restore, the rule of law. These are the things we need to do. We don't need to go to war. War is the last thing we need.
Yeah, it seems like that the folks who are running the show in D.C. Have kind of gotten the memo from their donors or somebody that America's days as a national entity are over, they're dwindling, and that they're kind of using up our resources as this kind of Rottweiler to injure another party, as in, Russia and so forth, on the way out. It's kind of like this old dog's going to be taken out to pasture to be shot soon. So let's go ahead and let this dog run its, rabid energy into this other one, Russia, that we don't like. And together that they will neutralize and diminish and demoralize their respective cultures. And then that will set up the place for a more globalist one world government. That's the way I look at it.
Well, I'm sure you're right, but their concept of one world government, I think, is one world financial domination.
Yeah.
If they can financially dominate everything, which is what both China and Russia and now India, the BRICS, the Saudis, everyone is now backing away and saying, look, we're going to stop using dollars. Yeah. You're not going to dominate us. You're not going to control us. You're not going to manipulate us. So they've clearly gotten the memo. And you have to look at the people who control finance and the media and Hollywood, and you begin to discover who's controlling events on the Hill. Which hedge fund managers are the big donors? Who are they? What do they want? They all want the same thing. They want to destroy Russia. Well, they want to remove Putin, and they want to essentially divide Russia up, strip it of its resources, and sell it off. That's what they want. This has nothing to do with the things that are publicly stated. This is just one huge corrupt operation, and we're being exploited just as the Ukrainian people are being exploited to do it. We got to stop it.
Do you think the Western oligarchs got into the ear of Prigozhin, or do you think that was just totally unrelated?
That has not. Don't worry about Prigozhin. I don't know what happened with regard to his death, but Prigozhin was somebody who was enormously popular. He was popular because he expressed this view that we discussed earlier. Why are we waiting around to crush these people? Why don't we just get this war over with? That was the view he was expressing, and that's widely held in the senior ranks of the Russian military. There are also a lot of people in the Russian government that feel that way. Putin is not anything like the person described in the Western media. He was the one Russian leader who, first of all, spent time in the West. He knew something about Western civilization. The man speaks fluent German. He spent years in Germany. This is someone who likes the West. He wants a good relationship with the West. He wants to do business with the West. He doesn't want to fight it. This is all being turned on its head by these financial oligarchs in the West, as you point out. They're very dangerous, and they're not just in the West. Just like this man Kolomoisky, who's now been arrested, which is a joke because he's a billionaire oligarch who picked Zelensky from nowhere and made him president of Ukraine. But of course, he was busy laundering billions of dollars and putting them into his account, just as Zelensky and his friends are doing in Cypriot banks or Israeli banks or something else. This sort of nonsense is a great facade. Oh, I'm arresting Kolomoisky because he's bad, he's corrupt. That's sort of like telling Willie Sutton, I'm going to start guarding banks. I'm no longer going to rob banks anymore. And you find Willie Sutton in all the banks. What's he doing? Stuffing his pockets full of cash. It's a lot of nonsense. But Americans don't know the background, and there's no reason why they should. Americans are worried about what's happening where they are. They're worried about their own economic situation. That has worked to the advantage of this small minority that runs your government and runs our foreign and defense policy. They've been allowed to operate without accountability.
Your PhD was in German and Russian relations, and that seems to be the heart of so much of American foreign policy in that region, is to make sure Germany and Russia never get connected and allied in any deep way. What's going on in Germany from what you can tell? Are you starting to see any indication that the Germans have a backbone to start telling DC, stop sacrificing us, or are they completely demoralized still and going to go along with whatever we want?
I think the Germans have the national consciousness of a traumatized rape victim. And that's something that needs to be put aside. I think that the Germans, every time they feel as though they should stand up for themselves or defend their interests, immediately punish themselves and beat themselves over the head and say, you can do nothing. You must sacrifice yourself because of what happened 80, 90 years ago. This is nonsense, but it's been exploited by these globalist elites that currently dominate Berlin. Now, Germany's on a suicide path. They're on the road to deindustrialization. Here's one of the greatest scientific industrial bases in the world, with some of the best human capital in the world, that operates as an engine of prosperity, not just for itself, but for Europe. They're tired, I think, in many cases, of being the sort of milk cow for everyone, for effectively bailing everyone out financially when anything's gone wrong. You take Germany out of the Euro zone, there's no Euro. You take Germany out of the EU, there's no EU. Germans understand that. They've tried to bend over backwards to make everyone happy, and what's their thanks and gratitude? In most cases, people pour buckets of filth and abuse all over their heads. You know, everybody in Europe that is not German wants to blame the Germans for their problems, which is nonsense. Now, the Germans over the previous 300 years, with the exception of two brief periods, World War I and World War II, have actually had excellent relations between themselves and the Russians. They're natural partners, strategic partners, for reasons of economics and finance, and also for reasons of strategy. We went ahead, and it appears that I think Seymour Hersh is right. And I think he's, you know, I haven't seen the data, so I can't say with 100% certainty, but I think Seymour Hersh is effectively correct when he talks about how the Nord Stream 2 was destroyed. And Germans are beginning to say, well, if this is true and Seymour Hersh is right, why would our closest ally, the Americans, with whom we've had good relations ever since the end of the Second World War, really, why would they do this to us? And Germans are now beginning to ask whether or not they're really a sovereign country. And there's a lot of evidence that the Germans continue to behave as a vassal state of Greater America. This is not going to last, David. It's going to blow up on our faces. It's going to blow up in the faces of the people in Berlin, but not until things get worse. And here's a big message for everybody. It's going to get a lot worse in Germany. If we have the cold winter everybody is forecasting, it's going to be hell to pay in that country. You'd already have millions of homeless. Now you have millions of more unwanted migrants, this time millions coming out of Eastern Europe or Ukraine. Add those to the millions of Muslim migrants that were never asked for and never wanted, but Germany stolidly agreed to take them in because everyone was afraid of being called a Nazi if they didn't. That's about to end. And I'm afraid that when it finally ends, we're going to discover that we have very few friends left in Germany.
Yeah, and I hope that these different countries can learn to have a healthy relationship with their sense of themselves, rather than just go along with this kind of nightmarish bully tactic of anytime you have any regard for yourself, you're a monster. It's pretty obvious how despicable that is. Colonel McGregor, I always appreciate your time, and I do want folks to check out your website, ourcountryourchoice.com, and we look forward